Somewhere between canyon ridges and endless scrubland, Corbin Thorne found her collapsed by his well, a towering Apache girl, blood-stained and desperate. When he offered water, her eyes held suspicion, not gratitude. She drank 3 times, then vanished without a word into the hills. Corbin thought that would be the end of it. He was wrong. At dawn, he stepped outside to find Apache warriors on every ridge, silent, watching. Dozens, surrounding his ranch like a noose. One rider approached an old chief, face weathered by sun and command, his hand raised, not in greeting, not in threat, just waiting. Corbin knew his simple act of kindness had either saved his life or sealed his fate. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The old warrior lowered his hand slowly, his weathered face revealing nothing as he dismounted with the deliberate movements of a man who commanded respect without needing to demand it. Each step measured and purposeful as he walked forward 10 paces across the hard-packed earth of Corbin's yard, dust rising and settling around his moccasins while the morning sun cast long shadows across the valley and glinted off the weapons of the countless warriors who lined every ridge and hill surrounding the ranch, their silence more unnerving than any war cry could have been. And Corbin, fighting the hammering of his heart against his ribs, forced himself to mirror the gesture, walking forward his own 10 paces until they stood facing each other across 50 feet of ground that might as well have been the boundary between 2 worlds. Neither man reaching for a weapon, though both were aware of their presence. Corbin's rifle leaning against the doorframe of his cabin, the knife hanging at the warrior's belt, and in the stretching silence, the old chief raised his hand again, this time pointing not at Corbin but at the well, his gestures clear in their meaning as he pantomimed the pouring and drinking of water, his dark eyes never leaving Corbin's face as if searching for something hidden there, some truth that would determine what happened next. And Corbin nodded slowly, understanding dawning like the sun that now climbed higher in the sky, burning away the morning chill but not the tension that hung thick in the air as he said, "Yes, I gave water to someone yesterday. A girl." Speaking the words even though he knew the language barrier rendered them meaningless, but the chief seemed to understand anyway, something shifting in his posture, though his expression remained unreadable as stone. And he turned his head slightly to call out sharp commands in his own tongue, the sound carrying across the valley like the cry of a hawk, and movement rippled through the warriors on the eastern ridge, creating a gap through which a single rider emerged, and Corbin felt his breath catch in his throat as he recognized her, the girl from yesterday, though transformed, her tall frame now straight and proud on horseback, her dark hair clean and adorned with beads that caught the sunlight, her deerskin clothing decorated with intricate patterns that marked her as someone of importance. No longer the desperate, blood-stained figure who had collapsed against his fence, but someone regal, someone with purpose as she guided her horse down the slope with confident ease, approaching where the 2 men stood in their silent confrontation. And when she reached them, she spoke to the chief in their shared language, her voice musical but firm, gesturing once toward Corbin. And though he couldn't understand the words, he grasped their meaning when the chief's gaze intensified, measuring him anew, and the girl turned to Corbin, surprising him when she spoke in halting English. "I am none, daughter of Chief Nantai," her pronunciation careful as if she'd learned the language through careful study rather than casual exposure. "You gave water when I hunt alone, when I fall from rocks and bleed," her hand touching her side briefly where the injury must have been. "You ask nothing, you help only." And the chief, Nantai, watched this exchange with hawkish intensity, gauging Corbin's reaction as much as his daughter's words. And Corbin, understanding that his life hung in the balance of this moment, simply nodded and replied. Anyone would have done the same, though even as he said it, he wondered if that were true in a territory where trust was as scarce as rain, where the divisions between settlers and Apache ran as deep as the canyons that carved through the landscape. But none shook her head decisively. No, not anyone. Her words carrying conviction beyond her limited vocabulary. Many would see Apache and reach for gun, not water. And she spoke again to her father, rapid words that Corbin couldn't follow but whose emotional weight was clear. A daughter vouching for the character of a stranger, who had shown her kindness when vulnerability had left her at his mercy. And Chief Nantai listened, his face giving away nothing of his thoughts, as his eyes remained fixed on Corbin, weighing and judging in that penetrating gaze that seemed to look straight through to a man's core. Until finally he spoke to none. A question in his tone, though the words remained incomprehensible to Corbin, and she responded with what sounded like affirmation before turning back to Corbin and saying, "My father asks why you alone in this valley, no others of your kind nearby." The question hovering between them like the hawk that still circled overhead, patient in its observation, and Corbin considered how to answer, aware that his response might determine whether he lived to see another sunrise or died where he stood, settling finally on the simple truth. As he replied, "I prefer the quiet, the space to breathe, to be judged by my own actions rather than the expectations of others," the words feeling inadequate to express his rejection of the settlements with their politics and pretensions, their narrow views of how a man should live and what he should value. But none seemed to understand more than his words conveyed as she translated for her father, and something like acknowledgement flickered in the chief's eyes, a recognition perhaps of a kindred spirit who had chosen to live by his own code rather than submit to the dictates of those who claimed authority. And none added, "My father says we watch you now. We see what kind of man gives water to Apache." And with those words, the purpose of the gathered warriors suddenly clarified in Corbin's mind. Not an imminent attack, but a sustained observation, a test of character that had only begun with his encounter with none, and he wanted to ask how long this watching would last, what criteria would determine his worth in their eyes. But before he could formulate the question, Chief Nantai had already turned to remount his horse, the audience clearly over. No further explanation forthcoming as none followed her father's lead, saying only, "We will return," before they rode back up the slope to rejoin the silent warriors who continued their vigil from every vantage point surrounding Corbin's ranch, leaving him alone in his yard with the realization that his life had irrevocably changed, that the isolation he had sought had been shattered by the simple act of giving water to a thirsty stranger. And as the day progressed into afternoon and then evening, the Apache warriors remained, making small camps on the ridgelines, cook fires appearing as the sun set, pinpricks of orange against the deepening blue of the sky, a constant reminder of their presence as Corbin went about his chores with the weight of hundreds of eyes following his every movement, evaluating his habits, his routine, perhaps even his character through the mundane details of how he cared for his animals, how he worked his land, how he carried himself when he believed no one who mattered was watching, though now he understood that every action was witnessed, every choice noted by those who would determine whether he deserved to continue his solitary existence or forfeit it to the harsh justice of the frontier. And that night, Corbin lay awake longer than usual, listening to the distant sounds of the Apache camps, the occasional whinny of their horses, the faint murmur of voices carried on the wind, wondering what reports were being sent to Chief Nantai, what none might be saying about the white man who had offered water without question, and whether his simple life would survive this unexpected scrutiny, until eventually exhaustion claimed him, and he slept the dreamless sleep of a man who has surrendered to forces beyond his control, waking at dawn as was his habit to find the Apache still in position, still watching with the patience of people who measured time by seasons rather than hours. And so the strange siege continued into a second day, and then a third, Corbin forcing himself to maintain his normal routines, tending the cattle in the north pasture under the watchful eyes of mounted warriors who kept their distance but never lost sight of him, mending fences while sentries observed from the rocky outcroppings above, drawing water from the same well that had become the catalyst for this extraordinary situation each time, with the acute awareness that his every movement was being evaluated against some standard he could only guess at, the psychological pressure building with each passing hour, as he wondered whether this was an elaborate prelude to his execution or something else entirely, some ritual of the Apache that his limited understanding of their ways couldn't comprehend. And on the third night, as Corbin sat on his porch watching the Apache cook fires flicker on the surrounding ridges, the sound of approaching riders from the south caught his attention, men moving with stealth but not the discipline of the Apache, their hushed voices carrying in the still night air as they approached the corral where his horses were kept, and Corbin reached for his rifle, prepared to defend his livestock from what had to be raiders from the settlement 2 days' ride south, men who preyed on isolated ranchers with no one to witness their theft. But before he could take action, shadows detached themselves from the darkness, Apache warriors who had descended from their positions without a sound, materializing around the would-be horse thieves like spirits, and Corbin watched in astonishment as the raiders froze, then backed away, abandoning their plans without a single shot being fired, the Apache warriors maintaining a silent, menacing presence until the intruders had retreated into the darkness from which they'd come, and only then did the significance of what he'd witnessed strike him with the force of revelation. The Apache weren't just testing him, they were protecting him, guarding his property from those who would steal it, which meant their judgment of him wasn't complete. Their evaluation still ongoing as the siege entered its 4th day, and then its 5th, Corbin settling into a strange new normal where every chore was performed under observation, every meal eaten with the knowledge that countless eyes monitored his movements, until on the morning of the 6th day, he spotted 2 familiar figures descending from the northern ridge, Chief Nantai and Nun, riding side by side toward his cabin with the purposeful air of people who had reached a decision, and Corbin stepped into his yard to meet them, heart-pounding but resolved to face whatever verdict they had reached after their days of observation, standing tall as they dismounted and approached, Nun's face revealing nothing of their intentions as she spoke. "My father wishes to understand why white man helps Apache when most white men shoot Apache." Her English stilted but clear enough to convey the central question that had motivated their extended surveillance, the query that would determine Corbin's fate. And Corbin took a deep breath, knowing that only honesty would serve him. Now, artificial answers easily detected by people who had made a study of his character for nearly a week, and he replied, "I don't see Apache or white when I look at a person. I see actions, choices, character." The words simple but sincere as he continued. "Your daughter needed water, so I gave water, just as I would to anyone who was hurt and thirsty." And Nun translated his words for her father, the chief listening intently, his weathered face giving nothing away as his daughter spoke. But when she finished, he nodded once, a deliberate acknowledgement, and reached into a pouch at his waist to withdraw something that caught the morning light. A necklace of blue and white beads interspersed with small polished stones, the craftsmanship evident even from where Corbin stood. And Nun explained, "My father offers you this, made by his own hands," her voice taking on a formal quality that conveyed the significance of the gesture. "If you wear this, all Apache will know you are, under protection of Chief Nantai. No warrior will harm you or take from you." But then her expression grew more solemn as she added, "But other white men will see and know you friend to Apache. They will not trust you. Maybe they will hate you." The choice laid before him with stark clarity. Accept the protection and friendship of the Apache and face the suspicion and potential hostility of his own kind, or refuse the gift and maintain his neutrality at the cost of rejecting the hand extended to him by Chief Nantai after 6 days of testing. And Corbin understood that this was the true test. Not the days of observation, but this moment of decision, this declaration of where his loyalties would lie in a territory divided by bloodshed and mistrust. And he looked from the necklace to Nun's face to the impassive features of Chief Nantai, weighing not just his immediate safety but the kind of man he wished to be, the values he had come to this isolated valley to preserve and protect from the corrupting influence of so-called civilization. And he reached out with steady hands to accept the necklace, feeling the smooth coolness of the beads against his palm as he said simply, "I'm honored," before placing it around his neck where it rested against his shirt, a visible symbol of a choice that would transform his place in this contested land. The necklace hung heavy against Corbin's chest, not from its physical weight but from the significance it carried, the blue and white beads catching the morning sunlight as he worked his fence line on the 7th day, the Apache warriors still maintaining their presence, though fewer in number now, perhaps 30 instead of hundreds, positioned strategically on the ridges with clear sightlines to his ranch, a reminder of both protection and obligation that Corbin was still adjusting to when a plume of dust rose from the southern trail, signaling riders approaching at a steady clip, and he straightened, hand instinctively moving to touch the beaded necklace as he squinted against the glare, counting 15 men on horseback, all armed with rifles, their formation too organized to be random travelers, too purposeful to be peaceful. And as they drew closer, Corbin recognized the bearded man at their head, McGregor. self-appointed leader of the militia from the settlement 2 days south, a man who'd appointed himself protector of settler interests with more enthusiasm than wisdom, his bushy beard and perpetual scowl as much a trademark as the Colt revolver he wore low on his hip. And Corbin set down his fence tools, walking back toward his cabin with measured steps, aware that this confrontation had been inevitable from the moment he accepted Nantai's gift, from the moment he chose to stand between worlds rather than firmly in one. And he stopped in his yard, waiting as the riders approached, dust billowing around them as they formed a loose half-circle, blocking the path to his corral but leaving the way to his cabin open, a small tactical mercy that Corbin noted even as McGregor dismounted, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth with deliberate force, spurs jangling as he took 2 steps forward, eyes fixed not on Corbin's face but on the necklace, the visible symbol of a choice. McGregor clearly found incomprehensible as he said, "Heard some strange reports. Thorn," his voice carrying the rough edge of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Apache warriors camping on the ridges around your place, watching but not attacking, and here you are, unharmed, wearing their trinkets." The word trinkets laden with contempt as his hand rested near his holster. Not drawing but ready, a posture mirrored by his men who remained mounted, rifles resting across their saddles. "So I've got to ask, are you their hostage or their friend?" The question hanging in the air like gun smoke after a shot, and Corbin was acutely aware of the Apache warriors on the ridges above, watching this exchange with the stillness of predators deciding whether to strike, weapons ready but holding position, waiting to see how Corbin would handle this intrusion, this test of the choice he had made, and he replied with careful deliberation, "Neither hostage nor friend, McGregor, just a man who gave water to someone who needed it and found respect where I didn't expect it," his hand rising to touch the necklace again, a gesture that caused several of the riders to tense, fingers tightening on their weapons. "The Apache have been testing me, watching to see what kind of man lives alone in this valley, and they've decided I'm not their enemy." The word simple but laden with a significance that McGregor couldn't miss, especially when Corbin added, "They're not hostile to those who respect their territory, who don't push for land that isn't theirs to take." And McGregor's scowl deepened, the implication clear that Corbin was siding with the Apache perspective over settler expansion, and a young rider with Apache beard, barely more than a boy playing at being a man, spat in the dust and said, "Sounds like you've gone native, Thorn, trading your own kind for savages," his voice cracking on the final word, betraying his youth and inexperience. But McGregor raised a hand, silencing him with a gesture that conveyed authority earned through more than just bluster, his eyes never leaving Corbin as he replied, "You're making a dangerous choice, Thorn, standing between worlds like this. Sooner or later, you'll have to pick a side when trouble comes, and it always comes." The warning delivered without overt threat but with the certainty of a man who had seen how conflicts on the frontier inevitably escalated, how middle ground disappeared beneath the trampling of opposing forces, the territories changing, settlements pushing farther west every season, more people claiming land that the Apache have used for generations. There's no room for fence-sitters in what's coming, and Corbin nodded, acknowledging the truth in McGregor's assessment even as he rejected the conclusion, saying simply, "I've made my choice, McGregor. I'm choosing to judge individuals by their actions, not by who their people are or where they were born," his hand still resting on the necklace. "If that puts me between worlds, so be it. At least I'll sleep knowing I didn't contribute to bloodshed that doesn't need to happen." And the silence that followed stretched taut as a bowstring, the militia riders exchanging glances, some confused, some contemptuous, as McGregor studied Corbin with narrowed eyes, clearly recalibrating his assessment of the solitary rancher he'd previously considered harmless, if eccentric, in his preference for isolation. And finally the bearded man nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement if not agreement, saying, "Your funeral, Thorn," before turning back to his horse, the words carrying finality without specific threat as he added, "Don't expect us to ride to your rescue when you figure out you've backed the wrong horse in this race." And with that, he swung into his saddle, signaling his men with a jerk of his chin, and the militia riders wheeled their mounts, dust rising around them as they rode south, leaving Corbin standing alone in his yard, The confrontation ended without violence, but with the clear understanding that a line had been drawn, a division created that would not easily be bridged, and he watched until they disappeared from view, the plume of dust marking their passage gradually settling in the still air of the valley. And only then did he become aware of a presence behind him, turning to find none standing there, having approached with the silent skill of her people while his attention was fixed on the departing militia, her tall figure somehow both formidable and graceful as she regarded him with dark eyes that missed nothing, saying simply, "They will return with more men." Her English, halting but her meaning clear. "They fear what they do not understand." And Corbin nodded, knowing she was right. That MacGregor would not simply accept what he had seen, but would weave it into a narrative that justified further action, perhaps even violence, against a man perceived to have betrayed his own kind, and he invited none to sit on the porch of his cabin, an offer she accepted with a slight inclination of her head, her movements revealing the lingering stiffness from the injury that had first brought her to his well as she seated herself on the rough wooden bench, looking out across the valley that had suddenly become contested ground. And in the lengthening shadows of late afternoon, she began to speak, her voice low and melodious despite the occasional struggle with English words, telling Corbin of her people, of the Apache, not as the bloodthirsty savages of settler stories, but as families and clans, with histories stretching back beyond memory, with customs and beliefs as complex and meaningful as any brought from across the great waters, with a connection to the land that went beyond ownership to something closer to stewardship, to belonging. And she spoke of how that land had been shrinking season by season, how promises made by men in distant cities were broken almost before the ink had dried, how peace seemed an increasingly impossible dream as more settlers pushed into territory the Apache had used for hunting and gathering across countless generations, their very survival threatened, not just by bullets but by the steady encroachment that left less and less space for a people who moved with the seasons, rather than fencing static parcels. And as twilight gathered, and Corbin lit a lamp that cast golden light across the porch, none revealed something he had not known, something that cast his simple act of giving water in an entirely new light, saying, "When you find me at well, I not just hunting alone, I testing water for my father," her eyes holding his to ensure he understood the significance of what she was sharing. Chief Nantai very sick, hidden in rocks nearby, needing clean water but afraid of poison. The revelation striking Corbin like a physical blow as he realized the magnitude of what had transpired. "You give water freely. I drink 3 times to be sure. Then bring to my father. You save his life without knowing." And she touched the necklace at his throat with a gesture almost reverent, adding, "This why he watch you for 6 days, to know if watergiver worthy of trust, if one good action was true nature or just accident." The pieces falling into place for Corbin now, the extended observation making sense in light of what had truly been at stake. Not just the welfare of a chief's daughter, but the life of the chief himself. A man whose leadership kept hundreds of Apache from open warfare with the encroaching settlers, whose wisdom maintained a fragile balance in a territory teetering on the edge of bloodshed. And as the night deepened around them, none shared more of her people's ways, explaining the significance of the patterns on the necklace he wore, each design carrying meaning related to protection, respect, and recognition, teaching him words in her language that might one day save his life if encountered by Apache from other bands, showing him the proper gestures of greeting and respect when meeting a chief or elder. And in turn, Corbin found himself sharing his own story, words flowing more freely than they had in years as he spoke of leaving a society back east where men were measured by their wealth and connections, rather than by their character or actions, where appearances mattered more than substance, where he had felt suffocated by expectations that had nothing to do with the kind of man he wished to be. His decision to seek the frontier born not from a desire for adventure or riches, but from a need for space to live according to his own values, to be judged on his own terms rather than against artificial standards that felt hollow and meaningless. And as they talked, the gulf between their worlds seemed simultaneously vast and insignificant, their differences in custom and language overshadowed by a shared understanding of what mattered most: integrity, respect, the freedom to determine one's own path, finding common ground despite having been raised in cultures that considered each other enemies. And when the hour grew late, None departed as silently as she had arrived, leaving Corbin with much to consider as he prepared for sleep. His perspective shifted by insights into a people he had previously known only through rumors and fearful whispers. His resolve strengthened to maintain the middle ground he had chosen despite MacGregor's warning, despite the challenges that would surely come. And the next morning brought those challenges into sharper focus when an Apache scout arrived at dawn, speaking rapidly to the warriors stationed on the nearest ridge before disappearing back into the hills, and by midday, none returned. Her expression grave as she explained, "My father's scouts here talk in settlement. Militia gather more men to come for you." Her words confirming what Corbin had suspected would happen. "They say Apache bewitch you with magic. Say they must rescue you from evil influence." The absurdity of the claim almost laughable if not for the deadly serious consequences it portended. Settlers, convincing themselves that only supernatural intervention could explain a white man choosing to respect Apache territory, to wear a chief's gift openly, to stand between worlds rather than firmly on the side of those who looked like him. And none continued, "My father says his warriors will defend you if white men attack. But he does not wish for war. Too many would die, and in the end, more white men always come." The truth of her words undeniable given the relentless tide of westward expansion, the seemingly endless supply of settlers pushing into the territory year after year. And Corbin found himself facing a choice even more consequential than accepting the necklace had been. A decision that might determine not just his own fate but whether blood would stain the valley he had chosen as his home. And after long consideration, he told none, "I need to ride to the settlement, to speak with MacGregor and the others directly," the words causing her eyes to widen in alarm. "If I can, make them understand that I haven't been bewitched or coerced, that I'm making my own choices based on what I've seen and learned. Maybe I can prevent a confrontation that would only lead to deaths on both sides." But none shook her head, concern evident in every line of her tall frame as she replied, "This is foolish thinking, dangerous. They will not listen. They will see necklace and think only traitor." Her assessment harsh but not without merit given the deep-rooted fears and prejudices that shaped settler views of the Apache. Yet Corbin remained resolute, saying, "I have to try. I can't sit here and wait for armed men to ride into a trap, for your father's warriors to defend land that will only bring more settlers seeking revenge if blood is spilled." His decision made not from naivety but from the clear-eyed understanding that violence, once begun, would escalate beyond anyone's control, would transform his peaceful valley into another battlefield in a conflict that had already claimed too many lives on both sides. And though none clearly disagreed with his choice, she respected his right to make it, disappearing briefly only to return with something clasped in her hand. A small stone carving, polished to a soft sheen, shaped like a bird in flight, which she pressed into his palm, saying, "From my father, this mark you as friend to all Apache tribes, not just our band." The weight of the small token far exceeding its physical presence as she added, "Keep hidden until needed. Show only to Apache who question you, never to white men who would not understand its meaning." And Corbin tucked it carefully into the inner pocket of his vest, close to his heart, understanding that he was being entrusted with something precious, something that could save his life if he encountered hostile Apache beyond Nantai's immediate influence. And as he prepared his horse for the long ride to the settlement, checking saddle straps and filling canteens from the same well that had started this extraordinary chain of events, none watched with the solemn intensity that seemed characteristic of her, finally saying as he mounted, "You good man, Corbin Thorn, but good men die same as bad when bullets fly." Her words both warning and farewell as he turned his horse toward the southern trail, the beaded necklace visible against his shirt, a declaration of his position that he would not hide, would not deny, even as he rode willingly into potential danger, determined to prevent bloodshed through the simple, perhaps naive, belief that truth spoken plainly might overcome fear and prejudice, that one man standing between worlds might build a bridge where others saw only a chasm. And as the ranch disappeared behind him, Corbin wondered if he would ever see it again, if his choice would lead to peace or to his own destruction. But regardless of the outcome, he knew it was the only choice he could live with, or die with, and remain true to the man he had, determined to be. The settlement came into view as Corbin crested the final rise, A collection of rough-hewn buildings clustered around a dusty main street, and he nudged his horse forward, the beaded necklace visible against his shirt as he rode slowly down the main street, aware of how conversation stopped and heads turned at his approach, eyes fixing not on his face but on the Apache craftsmanship that adorned his neck, marking him as something other than simply one of them despite his white skin and settler clothes. And he continued to the central building that served as both general store and gathering place, dismounting with deliberate movements before climbing the steps to the porch where McGregor sat with several men, the bearded militia leader standing as Corbin approached, hand resting near his holster as he said loud enough for all to hear, "You've got nerve showing your face here, Thorn. Riding in wearing that savage trinket like it's something to be proud of." And Corbin stopped at a careful distance, keeping his hands visible as he replied, "I came to talk, McGregor, to explain what's happening at my ranch before men ride out looking for trouble that doesn't need to find them." His voice steady despite the hostility that radiated from the growing crowd, the muttered words, "traitor" and "Indian lover," that passed from person to person, and voices joined in. A shopkeeper calling out, "Maybe we should lock him up, keep him from running back to his Apache friends with our weaknesses," while a rancher suggested, "Or use him as bait. Let him lead us back so we can finally deal with those savages once and for all." And Corbin felt something harden inside him. A resolve that stemmed not from anger but from the clear recognition that he stood in a place where fear had twisted into hatred, where understanding had been abandoned in favor of simplistic divisions, and he raised his voice to be heard above the growing murmurs, saying, "The Apache tested me for 6 days, watching every move I made after I gave water to a chief's daughter who was injured. They could have killed me 100 times over, could have taken my horses, my cattle, burned my cabin to the ground, but they didn't, because they were measuring my character, judging whether I deserved to live in that valley peacefully." And he touched the necklace at his throat, a gesture that drew every eye. "Chief Nantai gave me this because his people found me worthy of trust, because I treated his daughter with kindness instead of fear." But the young rider with the patchy beard pushed forward, his face flushed with emotion as he spat. "Sounds like cowardice to me. Thorn, making friends with savages instead of standing with your own kind." The accusation striking at the heart of the matter. And Corbin met the young man's gaze directly, replying with quiet intensity, "True courage is choosing not to fight when given the chance, choosing peace when war would be easier. That's what I learned from Chief Nantai, a man who commands 300 warriors but seeks to avoid bloodshed despite having every reason to want revenge for the land that's been taken, the promises that have been broken." His words causing some in the crowd to shift uncomfortably, perhaps hearing an uncomfortable truth, while others hardened further. And McGregor stepped forward, asking, "And what happens when the Apache decide they want your land too, Thorn? What happens when wearing that necklace isn't enough to save your scalp?" The question revealing the fear that underpinned settler hostility, and Corbin answered honestly, "I don't know what the future holds, McGregor, but I do know that an attack on the Apache around my ranch will bring consequences none of us can control. There will be deaths on both sides, then retaliation, then more deaths in an endless cycle that leaves nothing but graves and grieving," before turning to his horse, recognizing that he had said all he could say, had planted seeds that might or might not take root in soil long poisoned by fear and prejudice. And as he mounted, McGregor called after him, "Watch your back on the trail. Thorn, not everyone here is as willing to listen as I am." The warning containing both threat and a grudging acknowledgement that Corbin's courage deserved some measure of respect, and the 2-day ride back to his ranch gave him ample time to consider those consequences, to wonder what awaited him in the valley he had come to think of as home. And as he finally crested the last hill overlooking his property, he was struck by the silence, the emptiness of ridgelines that had recently held dozens of watchful warriors, no cook fires marking their positions. The valley seemingly returned to the isolation he had originally sought, and a cold fear gripped him as he urged his tired mount down the trail, wondering if his absence had been interpreted as abandonment, if the protection offered by the necklace had been withdrawn, and as he approached his cabin, everything appeared untouched. The corral where his horses nickered a greeting, the cattle grazing peacefully, the well still standing with bucket and ladle hanging just as he had left them. but the absence of the Apache presence felt suddenly like a loss rather than a relief, a return to a solitude that now seemed hollow after the complex interactions of the past week, and he dismounted slowly, leading his horse toward the corral. And it was then that movement caught his eye, the door of his cabin opening, a tall figure emerging into the golden light of sunset, and relief flooded through him as he recognized Nun, her presence answering at least one of his questions, suggesting that whatever had caused the Apache withdrawal, it wasn't complete abandonment, and she approached with that fluid grace that seemed at odds with her imposing height, saying, "You return alone. This is good." Her simple statement containing layers of meaning that Corbin understood immediately. She had feared he might return with militia riders in pursuit, and Nun watched his movements with observant eyes, saying after a moment, "My father's scouts watch settlement after you leave. They say many arguments, much talking. No agreement yet about what to do," her words confirming that his visit had created division rather than consensus. And inside he found evidence of her presence during his absence. A small fire burning in the hearth, a pot of something aromatic simmering above it, and she explained as he sank gratefully into his chair. "My father received word of your journey to settlement, how you speak truth with neck gift showing. He say you pass final test, willing to risk own safety to prevent conflict between peoples." The revelation striking Corbin with the force of unexpected recognition, the understanding that his impulsive journey had been the culmination of the testing that had begun when Nun first collapsed against his fence. And Nun continued, "My father's band moved north now, to summer grounds in high country, away from white settlements, away from growing tension," explaining the absence of warriors on the ridges, adding, "Too dangerous to stay here now. Too many white men pushing into hunting lands, looking for fights they will regret starting." And as night fell fully and they shared the simple meal she had prepared, Nun spoke of her father's decision, of the wisdom that recognized when withdrawal was strength rather than weakness, when preserving one's people meant choosing the battles that could be won rather than fighting every encroachment regardless of cost. And as Nun prepared to leave, to rejoin her father's band on their journey north, she paused in the doorway, saying simply, "Remember what you learned, watergiver," the name carrying a significance that transcended his identity as Corbin Thorne, connecting him to the moment that had changed everything. And then she was gone, slipping into the darkness with that silent skill of her people, leaving Corbin alone with the knowledge that he stood in a place between worlds, and 3 weeks passed in a strange new normal. Corbin working his land with a solitude that felt different now, not the isolation of a man hiding from the world, but the intentional separation of one who had chosen his own path regardless of the expectations of others. The necklace, a constant presence against his chest, visible evidence of his decision to judge people by their actions rather than their origins. And he was mending the corral gate when dust rose on the southern trail once more, signaling riders approaching his ranch, and he straightened, counting 8 men this time, fewer than before but better armed. Rifles gleaming in the midday sun, McGregor at their head. The bearded militia leader returned as Corbin had known he eventually would, drawn by the unfinished business between them, and he set down his tools, walking out to meet the riders as they formed their now familiar half-circle in his yard, and McGregor dismounted, boots striking the hard earth as he said without preamble, "Heard rumors, Thorne. Heard a rancher out here's been trading with the enemy." The accusation plain in his tone, and Corbin touched the beadwork at his throat as he replied, "I'm not trading with anyone, McGregor. I'm living in peace," which seems a practical choice in hostile territory. And a rider behind McGregor called out, "That's Apache beadwork. You're wearing their colors? Makes you one of them." The reduction of complex human interaction to simplistic tribal affiliations, and Corbin felt a calmness settle over him, a certainty about who he was and where he stood that had been hard-won through the extraordinary events of the past month, as he said, "You want to know why I'm wearing this? Because I gave water to a dying girl, and it turns out her father commands 300 warriors. They tested me for 6 days. I passed. They offered protection. I accepted. That's the whole story." The truth laid bare without embellishment or apology, and McGregor stepped closer, his expression unreadable beneath the bushy beard as he asked, And you think that makes you special, Thorn? Think that makes you different from the rest of us trying to survive out here? And Corbin shook his head. No, I think it makes me smart. You came here hunting Apache. How many did you kill? The question hanging in the air unanswered. You rode in looking for a fight and found an army instead. You turned back because you knew you'd lose. I made a different choice. I chose not to fight at all. And one of the riders spat and muttered, "Coward's choice." The insult lacking power when measured against the reality of what Corbin had faced, and he acknowledged it with a slight nod. Maybe, but I'm alive. My ranch is standing, and I can sleep at night knowing I didn't start a war that would get good men killed on both sides. And McGregor studied him for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. Not agreement, perhaps, but recognition of a conviction that went beyond fear or expedience. And finally the bearded man said, "You're a damn fool, Thorn, but you're an honest one," before turning to his men and adding, "Mount up, we're wasting time here." His decision to leave without further confrontation surprising some of his companions, one asking incredulously, "We're just letting him go?" And McGregor replied, "He ain't hurting anyone, and if the Apache want to leave him alone, that's their business. We got real problems to deal with, settlers getting raided, families needing protection. This man ain't one of them problems." A practical assessment that allowed him to withdraw without losing face, and as the riders prepared to depart, McGregor looked down from his saddle one last time, saying, "But don't expect us to come running if you need help, Thorn. You made your choice. Live with it." The warning containing both threat and a grudging respect. And Corbin nodded, replying simply, "I intend to." As the militia, riders wheeled their mounts and rode out, leaving him standing alone in his yard. The confrontation ended not with violence but with something closer to understanding. And that evening, as the sun dipped toward the western hills, Corbin caught movement on a distant ridge. A single rider silhouetted against the fading light, tall and straight in the saddle, and he knew immediately that none had returned. Watching from a distance to ensure he had survived the confrontation, and when she saw him looking, she raised one hand in acknowledgement, a gesture that bridged the physical distance between them, before turning her horse and disappearing into the gathering shadows, leaving Corbin to touch the necklace at his chest, the tangible symbol of a choice that had cost him the trust of his own people but earned him something more valuable. Genuine peace in a land where peace was as rare as rain. And as he went inside his cabin, lighting a lamp against the coming dark, he understood that his legacy would not be measured in land claimed or enemies defeated, but in the quiet example he set by offering water to all travelers regardless of origin, by judging each person on their own merits rather than the color of their skin or the language they spoke, creating in his isolated valley a small island of humanity in a territory torn by prejudice and violence, a choice that might seem insignificant against the vast tide of history, but that represented, in its own way, the kind of courage that went beyond drawing weapons to the harder task of extending hands across divides that others considered unbridgeable.